Hello and welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. Today we are just steps away from the White House here in the Dwight D. Eisenhower Executive Office Building, also known as the EEOB. Here, overlooking the West Wing, is what has been called a masterpiece of Second Empire style. But this building has had its share of critics over the years, as it looks much different than most government buildings which were made in the neoclassical style. Ground was broken on this building in 1871, and it took 17 years to be completed. It was designed by supervising architect of the Treasury, Alfred Mullett. The granite, slate, and cast iron exterior still stands more than 150 years later. In the 19th century, the EEOB housed the Departments of State, War, and the Navy, and was the world's largest office building after the Civil War. Now, this building houses the Office of the Vice President, most senior presidential staff members, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and the National Security Council staff, among others. Though it was threatened with alteration or even demolition several times throughout its existence, and even survived a couple of fires, the EEOB was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1969. One reason this historic building remains in working condition is thanks to the preservation efforts of our guest today, John F.W. Rogers. In the 1980s, during President Reagan's presidency, John served as an assistant to the president, and it was during that tenure when he spearheaded the effort to renovate the entirety of this very building. Today, John is Executive Vice President of the Goldman Sachs Group, and he's also Chairman of the Board of the White House Historical Association, a role in which he continues his dedication to historic preservation, and we are very grateful for his leadership and for his friendship and support. He is also a recipient of the Presidential Citizen Medal. A few years ago, the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts released this incredible book called Palace of State, edited by Thomas E. Lupke, for which John wrote the preface. I'm excited to be here today with John to not only talk about this building's rich architectural and historic legacy, but to take you on an actual tour as we walk through this magnificent building and see some of the incredible spaces and rooms. So John, thank you for being with us here today, and I'm excited to hear your story and to talk about this extraordinary building.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I thank you for reuniting me with my first love.
So John, let's start where it all began. I believe you were an 18-year-old young man when you first entered this building and worked in the mailroom. Tell us about that story and your very first memory of coming into this building.
Well, actually, Stuart, my first engagement with this building happened when my father brought me and my two brothers on a tour of the White House in 1970. And as a 12-year-old, I was just, excited about seeing the White House and what was going on. But as we exited the White House and we started walking down the street, all of a sudden I saw this enormous, beautiful, beautiful building with no indication of what it was. No one understood. I asked several people, what is this building? And the only thing that was there was a sign that said, Old Executive Office Building. And so when I came back in the Ford administration at 18 years old, before I began college at George Washington University, I was able to secure an internship here in the White House. I began in the mailroom, and there I got my first chance to have access to this building. And I took full advantage of it. I went everywhere, up, down, into the attics. To this day, it's been a great memory.
Of course, this year, 2023, we're featuring the presidency of Gerald Ford in our annual White House Christmas ornament. Tell us about how those Ford years were the foundation for your time here in the White House and how that inspired you to want to come back, to want to continue in a future presidency.
Well, I had a wonderful experience here. And of course, when you're young and you're seeing things for the first time, they always seem so much bigger than they do as you progress later in your life. But for me, this experience and having the office here, where I started first in the mailroom downstairs, and then later when I was in the research department in the presidential speechwriting office. So it was a unique experience, and as I've said, I had the opportunity to explore every aspect of the building, but the ability to be in, the rooms that had housed such great Americans who had served this country, and plus the enormity of these rooms, it just reminds you consistently of the public responsibility that anyone has for working here.
Did you already have an interest in history and in historic preservation, or did this pique that?
I did. I started in New York State, where I was born, and I was a member of what was called the Yorker Club. And my first experience was actually in the restoration of the kitchen, actually, of an early structure that was that housed the Seneca Falls Historical Association. And so as I removed the linoleum tile to expose the original floor, I thought this is the most exciting thing to be able to do, is actually to restore things back to the way originally how they were.
You used the words old executive office building, and that's how I first heard of this building and how it was referenced. But later it became the Eisenhower building. Tell us the story as to how that name changed and why Eisenhower.
Well, I find actually the name Eisenhower associated with this building to be quite unusual, because it was in 1957 that President Eisenhower's Commission on Presidential Office Space came with a recommendation that the structure should be demolished and torn down. But thankfully, because of the public outcry, but I think even more importantly, when they figured out the cost that it would take to remove all these 4 feet granite blocks throughout, the idea died. And it's interesting to this day that President Eisenhower is here. But we're here in the Indian Treaty Room, which is actually the site of the first presidentially televised press conference, and President Eisenhower did that.
Initially, the president and his staff were all housed in the residence of the White House, where the family lives. It wasn't until the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt that the building we now call the West Wing emerged. But there were some peripheral offices that were on each side, the west and the east side of the White House. At what point and how did it come about that the need for this building was realized and the plan to structure? We talked in my opening about the 17 years of construction. That's a long time to build a building. How did that all happen, and what was the motivation behind it?
Well, you mentioned the original structures. So there were 4 structures, 2 on the east side, 2 on the west side, and they housed the principal departments of government. They housed the Treasury, the State Department, the Navy Department, and then the War Department. Now, as the Republic grew, and particularly as we went through the Civil War, by the end of that conflict, we knew that as a republic, we needed to house a growing republic. And this building, which began its life and its first design, and as you mentioned at the outset of your remarks, with Alfred Mullett, who was the supervising architect of the Treasury. And first, the Treasury had the responsibility for the supervision, design, construction of public buildings. And so this process began. 1871 was the first year of its construction. It was to house the State Department. When it was completed, that building that previously housed the State Department could be torn down, which was on the east side. So that's where it began, the construction, to provide really for the growing needs of the nation. And the thing that I find really quite striking about this building is quite a statement about the permanence of the Union, and also, I think, the permanence of a federal system in the government housing the State Department, the War Department, and the Navy Department, those principal departments. The Treasury began its own journey on the east side, and that's why we have the layout that we have today between the White House and on either side, the 2 principal executive departments.
There's a beautiful symmetry with the residence in the middle and the historic, beautiful Treasury building, which you also had historic preservation responsibility for, and this building here. And this building is massive. This is not a small structure. It's on about 15 acres of its own. The number of doors and columns and the cast iron pilasters that fill the corridors of this building, I believe the corridors are 14 feet wide. Tell us about the design and the size and some of the spatial dimensions of this building.
Well, this building stands in stark contrast to the neoclassical temples that we see all around Washington. We see it in all the classical orders that have been preserved as its own statement about permanence and its own statement about an Athenian type of government. Now, this stands in stark contrast. It is a magnificent example of the French Second Empire style. And when you look at the superimposed columns of granite that are cascading down, I like to think, it is really quite amazing. Highlighted by mansard roofs, you know, it's very rare that you can see that, but that was a style that was becoming very popular at the time this building began its 17-year construction. So I think that when you see this building, you see permanence, you see the Union now together, and the future being marked.
But from the beginning, there were critics about the design and the look of the building.
You're absolutely right. I think it's been criticized by presidents, it's been criticized by architects, it's been called a monstrosity, it's been called a lot of an insane asylum. It's very many things, but it continues to this day to maintain its own permanence, which I find to be, you know, just wonderful.
Getting into the 20th century, government is growing, and the departments of state, war, navy, they move out into their own buildings, their own spaces, and this begins to be filled and occupied by offices relating to the presidency itself. Tell us about the evolution of the executive office of the president and how this came to be and continues to be the main facility where those offices are housed.
Well, it was going to house these principal departments: the state, the Navy, and then the War Department. The Navy was the first to leave. It was followed later by the War Department, and the State Department stayed here for a very long period of time until its new home in Foggy Bottom was completed. So once these major departments had left the building, the growing needs of the Executive Office of the President really took priority. And so from the Office of Management and Budget, which was originally the Bureau of the Budget, through all of the other elements, they were all to be housed here because the West Wing is far too small to house fully the President's staff.
Several presidents began their roles here in other capacities, the two Roosevelts among them. Tell us about some of the people and some of the stories of those people who began their work in this space and evolved to do other things, particularly the presidents.
Well, you named the presidents that have been here because they started in earlier lives. Two of them, two Roosevelts, began as assistant secretaries of the Navy. Their office is in this building. They later in life, other presidents have come and they've occupied different times. President Nixon had an office here he frequently used when he wanted to write speeches. He had a hideaway office which was on the first floor. And they have taken advantage of these rooms. Woodrow Wilson actually had one of the first press availabilities here. It wasn't certainly televised, but he had it in the old executive office building. So over time, this has been a place where presidents have been able to take advantage of the rooms and what they've been able to offer. But we've had numerous secretaries of state, secretaries of the Navy, secretaries of the Department of War. And when you think about that, you're just constantly reminded that this is not a disconnected series of presidents, but this is representative of what we really are talking about. The White House and this building is about the enduring presidency. And that's what I think we're all reminded of when we're here. We sit and work in these offices that have been occupied by so many other people before us.
So you first had a taste of exposure as a 12-year-old boy with your family. As an 18-year-old, you had an internship type of experience and then worked in the mailroom. And then you returned during the Reagan presidency as assistant to the president. Tell us about that role, what your responsibilities were, and how it came about that you had a real passion for restoring this building, and what condition did you find it in?
Well, I found that as we were planning to come in, the change of administration, which I was asked to take charge of by James Baker, who was become the chief of staff, it turned out that I, from my previous experience, knew every inch of this place, so I could lay out exactly where each of the different departments were going to be housed. I knew most of the people that were part of the career staff that were here. I had my start in the mailroom. My very first job was actually addressing the pardon that President Ford, Richard Nixon, because I was shown a room. It was filled to the ceiling with bags and bags of mail. There were telegrams from Western Union. The majority of them were against the pardon. And I was asked to compose letters to respond to these. Now that meant that I had to read the letters. So I read so many letters, and I find that that is one of the most interesting experiences that I've ever had, because I will go to my grave believing that President Ford's pardon was an act of true patriotism, because he sacrificed his own political future, in my opinion, to move the nation past that period in our political history.
Clearly, as an assistant to the president working in management and administration areas during the Reagan presidency, there are many demands on that role, on every office of the White House. How did you focus on the need to restore this building and find the time and the resources to do that?
As I said at the outset of our interview, I was in love with this building. So when I was given the position to be the administrator, basically, of the White House, I had the advantage of two things. First, a reorganization that had happened in the previous administration. President Carter administration created a new unit within the Executive Office of the President. It was called the Office of Administration. It was separate from the White House Administrative Office, and I was given responsibilities for both. So when I took over that responsibility, I said, okay, now I'm going to do something about the old Executive Office building. My very first thing is that I worked with the Park Service, because they had an incredible team. They had historic preservationists, they knew about interpretation, and I basically said, we're going to correct one thing. There is not a plaque in the front of this building that tells its history. Let's commission to have one constructed, which exists today outside, right on Pennsylvania Avenue, describing what this building is. And then, together with the really amazing people of the General Services Administration that were here assigned to the building, who were so wonderful about wanting to do the things that I had proposed, began the steps of laying out a master plan for its restoration. We were assisted by the Park Service. Their Harper's Ferry unit was just absolutely brilliant. And we began step by step restoring the main rooms, restoring the hallways, cleaning up the building, basically. And I had gone through all the attics. I'd been through everything, so I knew what existed in the structure of this building. So it was one of my number one priorities. And thankfully, I had the backing of the President of the United States.
That helps.
Yeah. The President went over one day, had lunch with the Vice President. After the end of the lunch, I received a phone call. The President said, I was just over in the old Executive Office building with George. We pulled up a carpet. It's got the most incredible floor under it, this beautiful marquetry floor. And as you know, Stuart, the Vice President's ceremonial office here in this building is the former Secretary of the Navy's office. So I got a mandate from the President of the United States, because he said, go do something to help George and fix this up.
Well, that'll put the wind in the sails of a project when the president has his imprimatur on it. What were the challenges and obstacles that you did face, though, in taking on such a significant and massive project that had such historic roots to it?
Well, the biggest challenge is everything takes time, and the research takes time, and I'm very impatient about getting things done. So I had to be able to put things in place that would continue this work past my time, to try to build the structure in place that would approve of sort of a master plan, and that we would begin that journey. And we were successful in doing that. And together with the help that I received from so many people, we were able to move as quickly as possible because the enthusiasm grew. The enthusiasm grew among the staff that were here, who took pride
Absolutely.
working in the building, but it also with the people who actually maintain it. And so we were able to do that. We restored a number of things on its exterior. We brought back the anchors, and luckily the Department of Navy was excited about wanting to do that. We brought back the cannons that I found at the Smithsonian that had been on the front of the building from the Spanish-American War. So we were able to really do a very collaborative team effort across a lot of different departments, all of which took pride because the history of the Navy Department, the history of the War Department, the history of State Department are tied up in this building.
Well, it's so rare when you work for the government that 40 years after working on something, you can re-enter that space and see that it's still benefiting from the investment that you and your colleagues made at that time to restore this extraordinary building to what it is today. That has to be a great moment of success in your entire career.
Yeah, because I have something I can point to, and I know that I did that. Now, all the budget debates that I was part of, all the other actions, they fade away. But when you have this ability to say, you know what, I did that. I participated with a group of people and we achieved this wonderful thing. That's very fulfilling.
Well, it's an extraordinary legacy and a great contribution to not only the people who have now worked here over these years, but to the country as a whole. And this book that we talked about, this Palace of State book, really tells that story. It's an extraordinary narrative as well as the images. Let's talk about this space that we're in now, this Indian Treaty Room. And there's some speculation as to how it received that name. Perhaps it was during the War Department years when Indian treaties were kept in this space. But this is one of many spaces we're going to see as we walk around this extraordinary building today. Tell us about this space. As we look up, it goes up more than 2 stories, a skylight above. The majesty of this room is extraordinary. Give us the history of this space and what was this room like when you first encountered it?
Well, this room is really particularly beautiful. This was created as the library for the Navy Department. Now, as we will see, each of these departments had a major room that was set aside for the library of each one of them. And each is different. This room has all sorts of naval motifs. In the railings, we see dolphins, you see seashells, you see all of these things, beautiful French marble, and most of the work here is attributed to the principal interior designer, Richard von Esdorf. And so this room, in its encaustic tiles, and its marble, was actually in the best shape of all of the rooms in the building because it had a purpose that was being used. Long ago, the stacks that were in here had been removed, but it became a reception room, a functioning room in support of the White House. So this room was in terrific shape. And it has seen many, many ceremonies being held in here. I've been in numerous things from staff departure parties over different administrations to ceremonies to award honors and medals, and of course, as we've talked about, use by different presidents to do things.
Well, I'm excited to see this building with you, John, and to see it through your eyes and how you undertook this project and these incredible spaces. The White House itself is open for tours, and at the White House Historical Association, accessibility is very important to us. But this building is not open to the public. This is an office building. Clearly people come in and have appointments. So what you're seeing today through the lens of the camera and through this podcast will be one of the only views people will ever see of these incredible spaces. And so I'm excited to share those with the followers of the 1600 sessions as we go and explore this building.
It's wonderful that you're doing this because people don't have the opportunity. When we finished most of the restoration, we had a program for tours, but because of all the national security related issues that the nation has confronted, unfortunately, this has now been closed to the public.
It's one of the most beautiful buildings in America, and let's go take a look.
Excellent.
So John, we've now come down 2 floors from where we were in the Indian Treaty Room, and we're entering into the ceremonial office of the Vice President here on the 2nd floor of the Eisenhower Building. This is a magnificent room which has only recently been made the Vice President's ceremonial office. Tell us about the history and the story of this grand space.
Well, this space was the Secretary of the Navy's suite. It was occupied by every Secretary of the Navy until the Navy Department moved out in 1918. It is now used as the ceremonial office for the Vice President, although Vice Presidents actually, it was their principal office, because it was only after Gerald Ford's administration and the beginning of the Carter administration that the Vice President actually had an office in the West Wing, and this became more ceremonial. Now, the interior, the selection of materials that are here, the furnishings are all from both the period or actually were part of the original place. So you have this same kind of motifs we saw in the Navy Department's library upstairs, capturing, you see on the architraves, the dolphins. All of this was all researched.
Anchors, yeah.
Exactly. The ships are here, are basically documented of the similar ones that were there when it was Secretary of Navy suite. These are from actually on loan from the enormous collection at the David Taylor Naval Base, which we went to and we secured because they have the collection of models for the entire naval history of our different ships. So this is really quite a magnificent space. General Pershing, he came as both the head of the Army, when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, was officed in here, and then throughout a long career, when he was heading the American Battle Monuments Commission, occupied this space. And in fact, Stuart, would you always tell me the history about the Hoover fire in the West Wing? Hoover had to displace Pershing, who was still over here, when he came over and moved his office in here during the period when the restoration took place.
Well, this magnificent inlaid wooden floor, you shared about how President Reagan and Vice President Bush had a lunch and they peeled up the carpet and exposed this magnificent floor.
There's a beautiful marquetry floor, and it just shows you the craftsmanship that existed at that period of time. And this room captures it both in its chandeliers, the floor, and all of the drapery that's used for it. It's really quite magnificent.
It is. Special desk, a really special desk.
This is an amazing desk. This is Theodore Roosevelt's desk, which has been used by presidents, has been used by vice presidents. And it has a very important drawer in this desk, which we should take a look at, because traditions are born in these incredible structures and their furnishings, and this one in particular, because here we have a series of vice presidents who've signed their names, and they've dated them when they were in use of this space.
And you can see here Joe Biden, Al Gore, Harry Truman, look at that, Dan Quayle, Dick Cheney. That's really amazing.
President Nixon used this desk himself, and you can see here the various holes.
Probably some public microphones and some private ones as well with President Nixon.
Yes, exactly. So this desk did have, as I understand it, some of the recording equipment that existed at that time.
So Vice President Harris will use this space for ceremonial occasions, dignitaries who come and visit, they'll come here, but she also would have an office in the West Wing.
That's correct.
Well, thank you, John. Let's move on to our next space.
Wonderful.
So we've just left the Vice President's ceremonial office, and across the hall is this beautiful little space, which is now the Vice President's Chief of Staff's office, but was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, obviously in close proximity. There are these wonderful pictures of those former Assistant Secretaries, including Teddy Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, as was Franklin, I believe.
That's
They both
correct.
played that role.
So this is actually one of the most historic rooms in this building, because it was the office of which two individuals, two Roosevelts, related to each other, both become President of the United States, both had a great interest in the Navy, both were Assistant Secretaries of the Navy. And so these pictures depict them in this office during their time as Assistant Secretary. So it's really remarkable. Not very many people get to come into this room. Many people see the ceremonial office because they have all kinds of activities, photographs and so on, but this is a rare treat, so thanks for this.
Well, imagine both Roosevelts, Franklin and Teddy, in this space as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, never dreaming that they may one day be right across the street as President of the United States. Quite amazing.
That's terrific.
Well, let's go to our next space. So, John, we have just walked down the hallway from the Vice President's office, and we're entering the diplomatic reception room, another grand and extraordinary space. And clearly, this building had the State Department involvement early on. Appropriate that the bust of Mr. Jefferson is there. And another long, beautiful conference table that tells the story of its use as a diplomatic consultation space. But share with us your memories or your thoughts on this space.
So the original department, the first department actually, in this building was the State Department. And so it continued here until it vacated to go to Foggy Bottom after the Second World War. So this space is very historic because very interesting things happened here. I think most notably is that it is in this room where the Japanese ambassadors waited to see Cordell Hull, the secretary, to deliver their letter, but the Japanese had already begun the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the time it happened. This is also the room where, before the Spanish-American War, that Secretary of State handed the Spanish ambassador his credentials. So this is a very historic room. And it's wonderful to be in this space. The secretary's offices were an additional space, so this is where a lot of the diplomatic activity would take place. And you can see the difference in terms of the style by the time this building was completed for the State Department. These magnificent gasolier chandeliers that were installed, the copper nature of it. And notice how different these chandeliers were.
Yes.
Because Stuart, one of the interesting things that each one of those three departments that we've spoken about, State, Navy, and War, had things that were unique to them. On these doors, if you turn right here and you look at these handles, this has the shield of the United States on it. Every single door in the corridors in which State occupied would have these doorknobs. Over the Navy Department, same thing. They would have doorknobs that depicted their department. So you never lost any chance of walking around the building and knowing what department you were in when you see this. And of course, we have the wonderful portraitures of different distinguished secretaries.
Another portrait of Mr. Jefferson at the far end.
So this would have had wonderful pieces of furniture here, but in a modern day, we have to make use of these rooms. And so here you can actually have a meeting with several participants.
And I think it's important to note that the history of the period when this building was built through the early 20th century and World War II, as you mentioned, but decisions of the day, and these offices continue to be making history. History happens in these spaces every day today.
It's just magnificent.
Well, let's go on to our next space. So, John, we've come out of the diplomatic reception room and we're in one of many corridors. I believe you said it's how many miles are these corridors?
1.73 miles.
Pretty incredible with this beautiful flooring.
Marble and black limestone.
Really incredible. I think the hallways are 14 feet wide and 17 or 18 feet tall. Again, we have the cast iron pilasters that are here, which are absolutely amazing.
If you look up above, you can see in these beautiful Corinthian pilasters here that with the acanthus leaf design, it's really quite remarkable.
And then again, it's staff, presidential staff that are in all of these offices that have the privilege to work in this historic space where generations of White House staff have worked before them.
Now, Stuart, we're on the second floor, so all the principal offices were on this floor for the different departments that occupied the building. We were in the Secretary of Navy's, we were in the Secretary of State's diplomatic reception rooms just a moment ago, and the Secretary of War's suite is down here. And originally there were two offices for the Secretary of War because the North Wing, when it was completed, the War Department immediately occupied. That's now the Office of Management and Budget, where its directors sits, beautifully restored as well. And then as this wing was completed, the Secretary moved here.
Well, let's go see the Secretary of War suite. That sounds terrific. So we've come down the hall from the diplomatic reception room in what would have been the Secretary of State's office, and we're now entering the Secretary of War suite. This room would have been the Secretary of War's actual office. There are these marvelous pictures here of Secretaries of War offices that would have been a couple throughout history. Really remarkable.
Yeah, so Stuart, we're in actually a suite of 10 rooms that were designed for the Secretary of the War Department. And of course, in the last construction of this wing of the building which housed the War Department. So this is actually quite wonderful because we're at the end of this period, closer to the 1888 here, where we see different techniques. On the wall, we see this beautiful detailing, which is Lincrusta Walton,
Yes.
which is a beautiful texturized, actually leather that has been depicted here. This was all restored. We started the paint analysis on this room in the very beginning of our restoration process, but we didn't have the time to get it finished until much later. It was designed by a prominent New York architect, and his name was Stephen Decatur Hatch.
I like that name.
So I thought you might like that name. And so he did the final work, and here's where the secretaries lived and worked during the period until they moved out of the department just before the beginning of the Second World War.
So as we go into, this is another of the 10 rooms. Let's transition into here. Really remarkable space.
This is a remarkable space again. Now look at the Lincrusta Walton, how it just shines by that texturized wall covering. Beautiful. And in the ceiling we have Mars and his chariot, picking up a whole series of different symbols of war. It's really an amazing thing because each one of these suites of offices depict a time period and a design motif popular at that time.
It's really amazing. You see the international flags as well in each corner.
Yeah, you have in every single corner a collection of various nations' flags all the way around. It's amazing.
This is quite beautiful.
And I think the thing that's different here, we've seen a whole series of fireplaces in the building. Here we have these fireplaces, which are ornate construction of wood. So much different than the marble that has dominated the other ones.
Absolutely, yes. But you still see the crest, which gives you the feeling of the connectivity to the function of the space.
Yes, and that same shield you'll see throughout office buildings of this period of construction in the nation's history. The Treasury Department has exactly that same shield that's been used throughout the rooms that have been restored there.
Yeah, of all the spaces, this is another one. If these walls could talk, what would be the stories, the wars and rumors of wars that have been discussed in this space?
Well, all the plans for the defense of this nation during the periods of time took place in this suites of rooms.
Wow. So John, we're entering a space that served as the War Department library from the time the building opened in 1888 until just before World War II. One of several libraries, as you shared, that were in this magnificent building. This is extraordinary. Tell us about this space.
Yeah, Stuart, this is my favorite room in the entire building. It reflects the style that changed, so you'll see the motifs are very Moorish. It's copper electric plating that's on these columns, the new technique of the time. And look how different the tiling is on this floor. Now we've seen the encaustic tile, the Minton tiles that we spoke about earlier, but here we have one that's returning to a different form. It has basically a sort of mosaic feeling to it that also captures this very, very different style. So we've seen the classical, we've seen Gothic, we now are here in this room with this wonderful Moorish style. I love this. This was used by the Signal Communication, White House Communications Group for a number of years. They turned it into a conference room. All of this was covered over. Fluorescent lights were installed. And basically, because of its history of just using it as a conference room and before that for storage, it actually preserved most of the features that are in
that's
here.
really
And
spectacular.
of course, it's the War Department, so oak and oak leaves is a
Yes.
symbol used throughout militaries for time immemorial. So really amazing.
And return and restore now to an actual working library. This is actually a working space for staff today. I want to share with our viewers an extraordinary space that's just outside this space, one of how many atriums in this building?
Well, this is one of two massive rotunda domes that occupy the building. Here we are on the west side, the other is on the east side, and we'll be able to see both of them. And they are beautiful stained glass creation. Again, Richard von Esdorf, the interiors, designed these. But the amazing thing that these were all painted over in the earlier life and all through the Second World War. They remained to until 1980 completely covered. And in fact, no one knew what was below the layers of paint.
So this extraordinary glasswork was not known to be there.
No, it was completely covered, and all it looked like was a major dome, rotunda, but did not capture feature. And it carries natural light all the way down through the floors. We're on the 5th floor.
Yeah, you can
of
see
old
the
executive office
stairwells that
building.
go all the way down. That is amazing. Do we have cantilevered stairs
Yes,
here?
all the way down. It's a magnificent act of construction that features all of these things. Look at these balustrades. The detail that has gone into all of it is really quite remarkable. So
Wow.
here we are in the East Pavilion, under that great mansard roof as we spoke about, and here is the skylight that was constructed on the Navy Department wing.
And to think that in the 1950s, thought was given to destroying this entire building and doing away with it. I cannot
It's amazing.
imagine.
It's very hard for us to imagine that people would think like that, but styles change, tastes change, and that's why it's very important in historic preservation that we remember these, where we've come from, and we remember that through the structures that we've built and what they represent. Because they take us from the past, they're a bridge to the future. And that's really what our great republic is about. It's a journey that's never finished.
Absolutely, absolutely. So John, we've entered now the Secretary of State or the State Department Library, another magnificent library space in the Eisenhower building. Extraordinary ceiling again. Tell us about this space, really beautiful.
So this is the State Department's library. We've now seen the library of the Navy Department where we began our tour today. We've just left the War Department's library, and here we are in States. All of the material in here surrounding is all cast iron. So this had the purpose of making sure this was fireproof. And Stuart, what two historic documents were kept here in this room?
The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution?
That's correct. Before the National Archives, they were housed here, which is really quite spectacular to think about this. Now, during our restoration, one of the things that's really magnificent about what we were able to accomplish is the original ceiling was untouched. So this is the only place where this ceiling was preserved, untouched during the renovations that we did. But here again, on these cast iron rails, you see the symbols of the nation, the shield of the United States in the corner, and a whole series of other motifs that capture the period. So very classical order here, same encaustic tiling that we've spoken about so often.
magnificent tile.
But look how we've seen the changes over time as we've traveled from library to library and covered the entire 17-year period of this building. These chandeliers are not original to the building. They are really taken from designs and reproduced, so they really are about capturing the period of an earlier design about 1860. So they would have been much earlier than, of course, when this wing was completed in 1875, 1876.
Well, you know, so many of the followers of this podcast are of a younger generation at a time where the information contained in these books and in these rooms would now be at their fingertips. But there was a time when these libraries were critical to the research, the understanding, the knowledge for the White House staff to have available here at their fingertips.
Yeah, it's amazing how technology is aided. And when we began our broadcast, I told you that I was for a period of time researcher in the speechwriting office. Well, there was no Google at that time. LexisNexis was just starting to come online. So you had to go to principal sources like this to find and check the facts. So it's amazing how we've changed over time.
Well, fantastic space, really incredible. So John, this is room 180 of the Eisenhower Building, and we're just right across West Executive from the West Wing and the Oval Office. And this had a very special use during the Nixon presidency.
This was President Nixon's hideaway office. He could come over from the West Wing. He did a lot of his speech writing here in this room. It had a private bathroom off from it. It had the equipment for listening devices were in this room as well. And of course, we saw earlier the desk that he had in this room, the Theodore Roosevelt desk, where we could see the different pieces of where actually the equipment was. Through that door over there, Stuart, it was a smaller conference room. And he had in that room all the political cartoons of his time surrounding the walls. So it was covered with every incredible cartoon.
Wow.
So this is a room that I don't think very many people who even work here know, because it's set up in this room now to commemorate a meeting with Martin Luther King with Hubert Humphrey. So it's really, and that's what most of these pictures are on the walls here.
Yeah,
so little do they know when they come into this room, this is actually where Nixon had his hideaway.
Wow, great story. John, we've come out of the Eisenhower Building. We're here at West Executive Avenue. We have the West Wing there, the White House across the way, these steps.
So Stuart, the steps we're on were the entrance to the Navy's wing. This is actually the steps that President Nixon came up to go to his hideaway office we talked about. Earlier I mentioned the anchors that we had restored during our restorations, which with the assistance of the Navy Department, we moved them up from the Navy Yard to take their place again on these two great pediments here. And there's been a lot of photographs taken from these steps. When President Reagan came back, the greeting card that met him as the entire White House staff stood on these steps. The photograph was taken.
From his time at the hospital.
And it was sent, the Goodwill card that was sent to him was from that.
Well, let's go on to our next space. So John, we're in the basement of the Eisenhower Building now. The corridors are not quite as glamorous as they are upstairs, but this is one of several recreational elements that have arisen over time, and this is very special. There are some elements here relating to President Truman.
Yes, so we're going to go take a look at this two-lane bowling alley, which was gifted to President Truman for his 63rd birthday. He was a bowler. I think actually President Nixon was the most avid of all the presidents as bowling. But then this was given to the White House staff to use by the president after he left.
I think, and clearly there's some fun has been had here by First Families too. You see Lady Bird Johnson is here bowling with some friends of hers, and this is actually one of two bowling alleys that are in the White House. The other is a one-lane alley that's under the north portico of the White House that's pretty much used just by the First Family. So let's step over here. There's the traditional shoes, the bowling shoes that are available.
Right.
And then the two lanes.
Two lanes. It's really quite amazing that this is sandwiched in down at the basement level of the old Executive Office building.
And it says Harry S. Truman Bowling Alley down there. And of course we know there's a picture over here of Richard Nixon. He enjoyed bowling quite a bit. Again, Pat Nixon and Lady Bird Johnson. And I'm sure this is quite a popular place for the White House staff and friends.
I think people can enjoy a break in their time and come down here for the stress management.
That's right. That's right. So shall we take a spin here?
Yeah. Why don't you do that, Stuart? I think you've got a
Okay,
nice,
let's see what we can do. So I haven't rolled a bowling ball in years. Let's see how this goes. A few.
Okay, I think you should stay with podcasts.
I'll keep my day job. But this is fun. There are several recreational elements on the White House grounds that the First Family can take advantage of. There's a pool, there's tennis court, basketball, putting green, and bowling alley. So John, thank you. This brings our tour to a close. We've had the opportunity to see so many historic spaces here in the Eisenhower Building today, the historic spaces of War, State, Navy, the recreational space of the bowling alley for the staff in the basement. But thank you for opening up this space for the viewers of the 1600 sessions to understand more about the history and the use of this amazing building.
Well, thank you, Stuart, and thanks for having me on your program. This has been a wonderful treat for me to walk down memory lane, to see some of the spaces that I haven't seen in a long time, and I'm really grateful for the series to be able to do it. But you've said something very important, which is not a lot of people get to see these, and through this broadcast, we're going to be able to share one of the most wonderful structures in our nation's capital.
And thank you again for your heart and passion for historic preservation for the White House and our mission at the White House Historical Association, but during the Reagan presidency to preserve this amazing building.
Well,
thank you, John.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. I've had the great privilege to bring you stories like the one here today since the program began in 2017. You can listen to the dozens of interviews I've done over the years on your favorite podcast provider, or you can watch them on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. All of us here at the White House Historical Association, thank you for your support. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you're helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, and even this podcast. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.